What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast. Today, Mike and I are super excited to be joined by Paul Revelia from ProPhysique.com. Paul's a physique and bodybuilding coach, and he has a lot of experience in the industry overall. And I believe you earned your Natural Pro card in 2009. Is that right, Paul?
That's correct.
All right, very cool. We really appreciate having you here today. And if you could just provide a little bit more background, kind of, who you are, if you can, for our listeners that may not know who you are.
Basically, I started competing in bodybuilding in 2007. I reached out to Lane Norton. He had a video series on bodybuilding.com called Life of a Natural Pro. So after I watched a couple of those videos, I reached out to him because I had been lifting weights since I was 17, and I was about 31 at that time. So it had been on my mind that potentially I could compete in a show. And after seeing that video series, I thought, wow, this is a lot more realistic than I thought. So I reached out to Lane. We started working together. I got on stage for the first time in 2008. This was right about the time that Lane was finishing grad school, moved to Tampa. So Lane and I became pretty good friends. And during that time, Lane's kind of coaching career was taking off at such a rate. He just kept telling me he needed help. Like he was looking for people to help out. He felt there was a big gap between quality coaches and what was available. So I resisted for quite a while. I had a career I loved, but eventually I caved and coached my first client in 2010, and that experience encouraged me to create my own business called Pro Physique. So that was born in 2010. Here we are, almost a decade later, and I've undergone, 4 or 5 different competition seasons. I've gone back to school to study nutrition and exercise science, strength and conditioning. Pro Physique is now a 15 employee business with 11 coaches. And my goal now is just to become the best coach I could possibly be. So, I still continue to compete. I still continue to learn. I guess you probably know more specifically what your audience would want to know. So I'll let you ask that, but that's kind of where I'm at now. I'm 44 years old. Pro Physique is my baby. But at the same time, I'm still passionate about coaching and being the best coach in the world.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Paul. Thanks for sharing all that. We appreciate having you here today, truly. So overall, what we're looking to do with this episode, it's kind of going to be a follow-up with 2 other episodes that we've done, kind of talking about setting up a bodybuilding contest prep diet. So kind of just getting right into this, we're going to ask about your general approach to setting a contest diet up. And we can all agree that protein intake and overall calories are going to take precedence here. And then after this, we're mostly going to be discussing the nuances that can be largely driven by individual preferences. But there are some coaches that, when they're given the option, lean towards more of a higher fat or higher carbohydrate approach. So we want to know here what your general preference is, and what do you tend to see the most success with?
Well, dealing with performance and physique athletes, I always try to opt for as many carbs as possible. I think I'll tend to keep fat pretty stable throughout the process. I'm not going to be doing a lot with fat, but I will manipulate carbohydrates. So, protein is pretty stable. Fat will vary to a degree. But carbohydrates are going to be the biggest variable for me, to make sure my athletes are still remaining strong in the gym, ability to recover and stay strong, keep muscle during contest prep is essential to being the best on stage. So I've always used that, not only myself as an athlete, but with my clients.
Now, is there a particular macronutrient distribution in terms of percentage that you're using for carbs and fats? You're breaking it up.
Well, no, I don't go by percentages, because there's such a variation in metabolisms. So
Right.
a lot of it's going to come down to the total caloric intake, because I have thresholds that I won't really go below. I won't really go below 20% of total calories from fat. Right. So once I start to approach that, that's when we start to do things like diet breaks, more cardio, using multiple refeed days, because we can get carbohydrates pretty low, even under 100 grams a day, but just not for long stretches. So a lot of it does come down to, my intake form for athletes does require them to tell me what their preferences are. So if someone wants, we can get into specifics, but if somebody wants to eat a little bit more fat, I'm certainly fine with that. And occasionally I will increase the fat for a day or two just to aid in digestion and, allow some recovery. But I don't set up macronutrients specifically based on like a 40, 30, 30 or anything like that. It always comes down to their history and their preference, and then what my experience tells me is exact. So to give you like specifics, I would have to have like a case that you wanted to go over.
Right, I got you. So in terms of generally setting, these macronutrients up, are you setting protein and fats kind of at a certain spot, and then throughout the process you're kind of taking and pulling from carbs, or do you kind of play around with fat and carbs, as it goes along?
Yeah, I'll definitely play around with fat and carbs, especially if somebody comes to me eating a lot of fat, right? So if I have a client that starts off, they report to me they're eating 100 grams of fat a day, I'm not going to knock them down to 50. I might, the nice thing about fat is, if you take 20 grams of fat, that's 180 calories. So you're getting a lot of bang for your buck calorically when you even just reduce 5 or 10 grams of fat. The issue that I usually run into with clients that have higher fats is fats allow you a lot more freedom in your diet. You don't have to be as selective with your food choices. When fat gets low, you really have to be particular about what you're eating. You have to eat leaner meats. You have to eat carbs that are like primarily carbohydrates. When you have a little bit more fat, you can include things like some foods that might not be that accurate. You can be a little bit more flexible with, eating foods and trusting labels. So when push comes to shove, I will get fats pretty low for that reason. I find it just creates a more specific approach, because I'm not going to give people a meal plan where they're only allowed to eat a few foods. I want them to create a meal plan of foods they enjoy, but with too much fat. And I even know this of myself. When I get my fats below 50 grams a day, that's when I start getting really particular about weighing out my protein sources. I do more rice. I do the things that are going to be kind of single macronutrient foods.
I got you.
So Paul, physique athletes can be a very unique population. So ultimately, adherence is key, which leads us to kind of opt towards the athlete's preferences. But for this population, there are many who will more or less eat dirt if you tell them it will get them to win their show. And for that reason, you might have these people who come to you and, they'll follow whatever diet you give them. And for that type of athlete, if you get them, are there any more objective markers that you're going to look at when setting their carb and fat intake? So in particular, I know like you mentioned, you tend to keep carbs relatively higher, but based on, are you using anything like maybe assessing their medical history, their background demographics, maybe some markers of insulin sensitivity to set their carbohydrates and fats? Do you do anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, our initial phone call always goes over diet history and medical history. I am not going to be working with people that have a psychological or medical issue to resolve. Okay, I work with performance athletes. I'll refer them to someone else. So, in regards to like, what am I going to set up for them? A lot of it just comes down to what they've done in the past. I've had a lot of experience of taking people's problems and kind of restoring their metabolisms, getting their calories back up again. Because, a lot of people come to me from teams or from other coaches that have used extremely restrictive dieting for long periods of times. And so, I try to strike the balance between doing what's right for them physiologically as well as psychologically. So, I haven't run into a lot of issues with insulin sensitivity that weren't the result of just beating themselves up for 2-3 years at a time, maybe some chronic stress, these kind of things. Once you start to allow them to recover and feel better, these issues tend to resolve themselves. So yeah, I mean, it really comes down to that initial phone call where I have to learn about, how many times they've dieted down, how many preps they've done, when was the last time they dieted, what are they currently eating, and that usually gives me a really good picture of what I'm going to be doing with them.
And I know you work with a wide variety of athletes, and a lot of those are females. Does your general approach differ at all when it comes to females compared to males?
Well, from a physiological perspective, not that much. I mean, I'm not going to put a lot of bench pressing in a female's program. So when it comes to strength training, women, before I coached women, I never wrote glutes on a program before. Like for years it was leg day. Now there's glute day. I will say this: women are resilient and very tough, and I think I've seen women go through hell just to get on stage, and so I love working with them because they're so hardworking. I think with men, the major difference is you've got to pry information out of them. They tend to be a little bit more stoic, a little bit to themselves. Women are very forthcoming. They will write paragraphs about how they're feeling and what they ate and all these things. So psychologically, I find they're very different, men and women. But I think that's probably why I've thrived in the female coaching community, is because I feel like I'm good at connecting with my clients, understanding them, trying to, I treat them all the way that they need to be treated. So, some girls, if you try to, treat them soft, they'll yell at you. And some girls, if you're not nice to them, they'll let you know that you hurt their feelings. So like, you have to learn the personalities of your clients. And that's something that I really enjoy doing, because I love coaching. I don't have to coach anymore. I'm at a point in my coaching career where I have enough of a business going where if I didn't want to coach anymore, I wouldn't have to. I still love coaching. So the goal for me is, between men and women, I think there's still individual differences. I have some women that can handle more volume than some men, and I have some men that, can handle some more volume than other men. So I don't look at it as like a female to male thing. I still look at it as more a specific client to client situation.
Awesome. So now I want to take a time to kind of transition topics here. Something that's kind of interesting that Mike and I have been discussing. In Mike's last episode, he was able to talk to Steph Noble and Dr. Andrew Chappelle from ProPrepCoaching.com. And then the previous episode, we talked to Cliff Harvey and Eric Helms about this. And we're going to be talking about kind of the regional differences in carbohydrate intake kind of around the world. So Eric and Cliff discussed some differences in carb intake between Australia being a little bit more partial to a lower carb approach, and then the UK tends to have a relatively higher carbohydrate approach. So have you noticed any particular regional trends in your coaching experience? Because we know you coach athletes from all over the world.
Nothing that would stand out to me. Nothing that would probably be statistically significant. No, again, I think that comes down more from client to client. Again, I probably haven't had enough clients from the UK or from Australia to compare to how many clients I've had from the US, Canada. Just the bulk of my clients are from here. I think there's been an increase in the amount of quality coaches around the world. When I started coaching 8-9 years ago, I had a lot of Australian and British and even German clients. It's gotten more specific to me now that I typically work mostly with Americans. So yeah, I don't know that I would have I've noticed some trends of like different races having different kind of tolerances for different things. Like I definitely have noticed, some of my like Asian clients tend to have amazingly adaptive metabolisms. And I don't know that that's a regional thing because, some of them live in the United States, but I don't know specifically that I've noticed like, okay, if I'm working somebody in Australia, they'll do lower carbs. That hasn't occurred to me.
Have you seen anything else with certain races and how they respond or how they eat?
Yeah, I mean, it's still a case by case basis because it's not always going to be the case. But yeah, I don't know. Specifically, I think no, nothing that I would be willing to like stake a claim to. I've seen. I will say this: my like African American or black athletes, whatever you want to call them, I noticed that they tend to survive on much lower carbs very well than most of my Caucasian clients. If I've had some male bodybuilders, if I get them below 200 carbs, they're crying every day versus, some of my like even world champion guys like, Ray Clark, and I'll get theirs well below 100. And I'm like, how are you? No, hey, I'm great. What are you talking about? I'm like, man, like, so, but then again, I've also worked with a guy named Lee Fort, and I had him on like 600 to 700 grams of carbs a day. So there's such a big variation that, I don't try to get caught up in region or race or stuff like that, or sex or anything like that. I really try to focus on the individual. I will pull on trends, but it's more about having a conversation with the person in a scenario. and not having my own bias, because I think we tend to look at athletes and compare them to ourselves. You know, like when I'm dieting for a show, I know that when my carbs get below 200, that's when shit gets real for me. But I have some clients that they don't even bat an eye at 50, 60 grams of carbs, you know, and I'm like, man, I would be just dying. So, yeah.
That's actually something I think I've heard Cliff Wilson talk about with his African American clients, and how he's noted that they tend to be a little less insulin sensitive on average, and how they kind of thrive on lower carbohydrate intakes. So that's super interesting that it seems like you kind of generally find the same thing.
Yeah, you know, I've had a few clients just thrive on low carbs, but again, you know, if you look at the muscle bellies and the density of some of those athletes, it's just remarkable. And I don't know if that has something to do with why they're able to get away with so few carbs, but yeah, I mean, you know, and again, you're dealing with somebody's history of dieting, so I don't know that it's necessarily the case it's because they're black that that's the case, or if it's just because of their history of their approach. Because like I said, you know, like, so someone like Deraja Hill, who when we first started prepping together, I think we got her down to 60 grams of carbs, you know, and now, you know, we keep her carbs between 150 and 200 most of prep. And that's because she and I have gone through multiple preps and reverses. So, you know, maybe there's some corrections that can be made through diet, maybe not. But, you know, again, you can't get too caught up in making sweeping kind of statements, because at the end, you have to pay attention to the individual.
Right, absolutely. But very interesting. So related to this, Paul, you've competed in a variety of classes. You've competed in bodybuilding, you've competed in classic physique and physique, and you also, as we've talked about, coach a wide variety of clients competing in all of the classes. Have you noticed any differences in carbohydrate intake between these athletes? So again, it comes down to the individual. You know, we don't want to get too caught up in the generally sweeping claims, but considering, you know, the typical differences in muscularity between the classes, does this tend to correlate with differences in carbohydrate intake between them?
Well, yeah, I would expect somebody that carries more muscle to be able to tolerate more carbohydrates typically. Not always the case, but I definitely think that. Now, for myself, I actually diet on more carbohydrates now, even though I'm in my 40s, just because I think I've added some lean body mass over the years, and I tend to stay a little bit leaner in the off season than when I first started. My first time competing as a bodybuilder, I probably ate less than last year when I competed in men's physique, right? So it wasn't necessarily the division that defined what I was going to eat. It was how my body responded to that. So yeah, I think again, it's always going to come down to the individual. You know, like how they respond in prep is going to determine how we adjust things throughout the process. I'm not worried about the division, except for how lean we need to get. Right. So there are some divisions that require a little bit more balance between getting lean and staying full and getting on stage with the right look. Whereas with bodybuilding, you just need to get the leanest you can get and be the most shredded possible. So again, those guys are probably going to get a little bit lower in carbohydrates by the end of the prep.
Yeah, it's kind of like an interesting balance, right? Because on one end, someone might think, well, bodybuilders tend to possess the most muscularity, so probably on average they consume more carbs than a men's physique athlete would. But then, like you said, they also need to get the leanest of all the classes, so that probably corresponds to maybe them having the lowest carbohydrate intake relative to the other classes.
Well, and you could even argue that bodybuilders probably shorter, you know, because you know, the best bodybuilders in the world are usually 5'8", 5'9". Men's physique competitors at the Olympia level, at the pro level, often over 6 foot. So just by that fact alone, they're going to be heavier because they're taller. And, you know, especially at the highest level of the pros, those guys are not, they're not much less muscular than the pro bodybuilders, right? So, or the classic physique guys. So, yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to compare, but I wouldn't expect it to be that different, because if you take a 5'6", 190-pound bodybuilder versus a 6'2", 190-pound men's physique guy, the 5'6" guy is going to look much more dense, but they're probably going to be pretty similar in their ability to, you know, eat.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Paul. Appreciate that. So we want to transition to our third kind of main topic here, that being refeeds. So the first question, do you utilize refeeds? And then if you do, what is your general approach to implementing them?
Yeah, so I typically don't start a prep with a refeed. I want to get the ball rolling, right? I don't want to start week one with having a carb up day, for a couple reasons. You don't really need it at the beginning of prep. Your glycogen stores are full. You're strong. You feel good. So I'll often go 2, 3, 4 weeks without a refeed until we start to maybe hit a sticking point, or I start to get some feedback that performance is suffering a little bit. Then I'll add a 1 day a week refeed. Which will usually consist of maybe dropping the protein and fat slightly and then upping the carbs, right? So let's say I have a bodybuilder, he's on 200 protein. Let's say he's 180 pounds. He's on 200 protein, 300 carb, and 60 fat. So his refeed day would be something like 180 protein. So I'll just bring it down to like a gram, might bring his fat down to like 50, and then I might give him like 380 to 400 carbs, right? So that'd be like so it's not like a gluttonous day of eating. It's basically just meant to restore glycogen, maybe give them something to look forward to. But the approach that's worked the best for me over the last couple of years is the multiple day refeeds. So I now have all my athletes in prep doing 5 to 6 low days in a row and then 2 consecutive refeed days once we hit our sticking point. And I've just found a much better response to that. You can use a little bit more moderate approach to the refeeds, and it really just gives the athlete like a 2-day recovery. Eric Helms was the one that pointed out to me that there was some actual benefit to the response in the hormones, digestion, and it's just a better recovery tool.
Gotcha.
So you mentioned generally starting out with the 1 day, and you tend to implement that just once performance starts to suffer, or when you start to see a weight loss plateau. Following this, when do you start to think that, okay, bumping their refeeds up to 2 days rather than just the one is probably a good idea? Are you just looking for another stall in weight loss, or what's the rationale?
Yeah, so usually when I add a refeed, it's going to be a week where I feel like I need to cut calories, but at the same time that I cut calories, I'll add that refeed in. Likewise, when I'll add a second refeed is when I feel like, okay, calories are starting to get to a place where I feel like they're not going to be getting fully recovered with a single refeed day. Bodybuilders are acutely stressed, chronically stressed. They're doing lots of cardio. Their sleep is interfered with. Their low body fat percentages is having, a lot of impact on their day-to-day, like overall neat well-being, sleep. So what I've noticed is that when I start to get an athlete that's just telling me like sleep's a little rough, training isn't that good, we've maybe hit a sticking point, I'll say, okay, we're going to make a big push. We're going to make a nice adjustment. We're going to drop you low 5 days in a row, but then do 2 consecutive refeed days, which would roughly be right around their maintenance, right? Might even drop their cardio off for those 2 days. So the goal being figuring out what is going to give them the best success for fat loss week over week. And what I find is that if you go too mild with the deficit, you end up just kind of puttering along, losing just very slowly. And this is psychologically tough for the athlete. But most competitive bodybuilders would rather push really hard. So what I find is I'm usually convincing them to pull back for a little bit. And that's what, multiple day refeeds are. It's basically just 2 days to rest, recover, and then we're going to get after it again. And that type of approach, and I even get into periods in prep where we might do 2 or 3 days of pushing real hard, then a 2-day refeed, right? So some very interesting things happen once you are truly shredded that, it's hard to document. It just becomes with experience and seeing it myself and seeing it in my athletes and seeing how they respond to peak week after shows. You just start to notice some trends where you can really manipulate just small variables and get a really positive response.
Do you find yourself potentially adjusting the frequency of refeeds for females specifically in order to better maintain the menstrual cycle throughout prep?
No, because I find that they're going to lose it pretty early on if they're getting truly stage lean, right? So, I have some girls that keep it all the way through. That's another thing that's a huge variability between females. Some women, the first week of prep, it's gone. Others, it's a couple weeks out. Others, they will lose the period itself, but they'll still get the symptoms, right? Others, they'll lose it as soon as I start doing the double refeeds. It'll kick it back on. If I do a diet break, it'll kick it back on. So it starts to get very very unique for women. And again, it's a case-by-case basis, but I don't ever do it for the purpose of getting their menstrual cycle to come back, because in prep, the goal is not to get pregnant, right? So I'm not, no female is interested in that, in getting pregnant during prep. Now, if our goal post show is to get their, hormones back in check, yeah, that's something that we'll pay attention to. But mostly the reason I'll pay attention to the menstrual cycle in prep is because we want to make sure that we're managing the symptoms if it's going to be something that impacts our show day appearance.
So now I kind of want to follow up and transition into potential negatives of refeeds or just incorrect application of them. And so you kind of already touched on maybe an incorrect application would be utilizing them too early in prep, which is something that I think is potentially interesting because everyone seems to be fascinated with refeeds right now. And I've noticed with other competitors as well, it's just from the get-go, they're utilizing, at least one refeed day per week. And, this probably isn't necessary because their overall intake is at a point which is high enough where there's probably no physiological benefit there. And then I think you have to consider is that when you're pulling calories away from during the week for one refeed day, let's say you're pulling 1,000 calories to push towards that refeed day, I think you're potentially compromising your training performance throughout the week just for this refeed day at the end of the week, which may not give you any benefit considering how early you are in prep and calories still being high enough. What do you think about that, Paul?
Well, my first prep I ever did, I got a refeed from the start. However, my calories and cardio were adjusted so much. I did not make an adjustment I don't think I had an adjustment for 12 to 14 weeks, right? So if you take an aggressive approach the first week of prep, I can see making a refeed something that you're going to use. And if I have a client that I've worked with for a long time and we've gone in and out of prep, I may be including a refeed, but that's because I have the experience of seeing how they respond. The difficulty with having a refeed at the beginning of prep in my mind is that you don't know how everyone's going to respond to prep. I mean, some people, they can be eating 3,000 calories and doing no cardio. You can drop them down to 2,500 calories and an hour of cardio or, per week, and nothing happens. So if nothing's happening, what is the benefit of the refeed? It might just, be that thing that's kicking you back into maintenance. And if you're using it as an excuse to eat a bunch of crap, then, then there's something else to address. So yeah, it's always going to be a case-by-case basis, but for the most part, I want to see the scale starting to move before I'm going to add in a refeed day. And then it's going to be a very specific approach to that day. And then we're always going to pay attention to how you respond. If somebody drops after a refeed, maybe we start doing multiple day refeeds early on. But yeah, I used to be of the belief that everyone should start off with refeeds. And then I would find that 2 or 3 weeks had gone by and we've been in prep and nothing had happened. And I myself, when I prep, I want shit to happen. I don't want to be like waiting for things to happen. And coaching is difficult because, I wanted to always do what was right for the athlete. I wanted to do things the right way. Let's keep cardio low and calories high. But I'm an athlete, like you said. If I thought it was going to help me to win, to eat dirt, I would fucking eat dirt. And my clients are no different, right? So it takes a while to learn that confidence, to be hard on people, to put numbers lower than you think are comfortable in cardio. But that's a part of learning and becoming a coach, because you have to ask, I'll often ask my clients like, hey, okay, this is what I think we need to do to see some progress. Are you in? 99 out of 100, they're in. I've had maybe 1 or 2 clients in my career go, if this is what it's going to take, I'm not able to do it. I don't have the time to commit, but most people, maybe 999 out of 1,000, they're going to be like, just tell me what to do. Tell me what you need me to do and I'll do it.
Absolutely. And then finally, I'd like to touch on the psychological aspects of refeed. So I think potentially the primary benefit of having these refeed days is something you mentioned earlier, is having something to look forward to and it potentially facilitating improved dietary adherence. But what I've found and experienced with some people, and I'd like for you to elaborate on your experience with certain athletes as well, is that when it comes to a single day refeed in particular, like you said, some people utilize this one day to eat a bunch of crap, and kind of deviate from their diet, especially if the calories on this day are way higher than it is on their diet days, and it goes from I'm looking forward to this day to it kind of becomes a binge restrict cycle, and they mentally suffer even more on their diet days because of their intake on this one day. So can you kind of tell us, what you've run into with clients with that, if there's any certain personalities or psychologies you found which may be contraindicated for refeeds?
Yeah, well, I'll say this. Women typically look at a refeed as a reward. And so some of them will be like, I don't want a refeed because I feel like it's a reward and I haven't earned it. So oftentimes I'm having conversations with them saying that this is not a reward. This is a part of the process. So yeah, you do have to understand the individual and, are they okay with a refeed day? I think earlier in my career, I was much more aggressive with refeed days. So if I had a guy on like 250 grams of carbs, his refeed might have been 500, 600, right? And this is how I approached it. Again, as a 200-pound male, who diets on 250 grams of carbs, I would try to have 450, 500-gram carb refeed days. And what I found was I would be ravenous on those days, and I would be so hungry the day and the day after. And it would take me a couple days to get back my normal hunger signals. It almost like made prep worse. And instead, what I found is instead of going from 250 to 500, if you just go from 250 to 350, right? Just that small bump, it really gives you the benefit of getting some more glycogen, but you don't get this crazy boost to, I don't know, all the things that can go wrong with overeating. And you're also much less likely, like you said, to eat a bunch of junk because, 100 grams of carbs is not that much food. So you still got to be particular with what you're eating. So a lot of it just comes down to, where you're at in the process as well. The leaner and leaner you get, the more and more dangerous refeeds become for that reason. They can actually, trigger a binge session. So you have to understand like where you're at, what the client needs, and, paying attention to their like individual differences and like psychology and eating patterns. Sometimes I'll even ask people like, okay, tell me what you ate for the refeed. And they'll eat the same things they eat during the day. They'll just increase their vegetables and they'll end up with a stomach ache, and digestive issues because their vegetables are so high. Whereas I'll be like, okay, let's try to get in some kids cereals and some easy to digest things that are going to allow you to basically not have digestive distress from a refeed. Because again, females, they almost want, I don't know if they don't want to suffer, but they prefer the feeling of, especially my females that have come from other coaches where they were on such restrictive plans that they almost feel like if they're not suffering, it's not prep. So yeah, it's, refeeds have been around for me since the beginning. I was lucky. My first coach was Lane. I did some research on coaching. So, I made the right choice. I would not have survived on a tilapia asparagus type of prep. I would have just given up the sport. So for me, Lane was the right fit at that time in my life, for me to figure out how to do it. So yeah, I've always used, that approach. I'm just very hands-on with my clients and understanding what their specific needs are.
Great insight. Just to follow up from that, are you taking any like baseline assessment or looking for particular things that stand out within the client's personality where you might be like, maybe I won't toss them a refeed at first? Or is it kind of more, you work with a person, you're just going to give them a refeed when you feel like the time's right, and then see how they respond, and then based on their experience, that'll kind of dictate whether you give them a refeed in the future or how you structure in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way to put it. What I'll basically do is if I've never worked with somebody before and we're starting prep, they're not probably getting a refeed right away. It's going to be, what I'll actually do is I'll put their numbers on their plan and I'll put refeed and I'll put, not included at this time. So they know it's coming, right? So the psychological is like, okay, this guy does give refeeds because there are some coaches that still don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'll put that on there so that they know that there is going to be a refeed at some point. But yeah, if I've worked with somebody for a long period of time, I'll often ask them, do you want to just go hard to start the first couple weeks? Do you want to ease in? Do you want refeeds? And they'll tell you. So yeah, I'm not going to give people a refeed unless I probably have worked with them, or unless they're already extremely lean. Like if someone comes to me very close to stage condition, then I'm gonna probably add refeeds in right away for them, because some people reach out to me 6-8 weeks out. They had a problem with their coach, whatever. If they're already that lean, then I want to start adding refeeds right away so I can see how they respond, how they look. So that's actually refeeds, and increased carbohydrate days are basically testing for the peaking process as well. So yeah, it's important to know when to add them.
Awesome. Cole, anything to add here?
I think that's all we have for you today, Paul. We really appreciate your time hanging out with us, chatting it up, talking about setting up a contest prep and the nuances that go into it. Where can people find you, follow you, and support you at, Paul?
Well, you're a podcast. How about that?
That's right. That's number one, the Muscle Memoirs podcast.
Muscle Memoirs podcast. My favorite mediums right now are YouTube and Instagram. I'm doing, we're stuck at home. I'm pretty much doing a daily video. I've got my camera right here. I'm going to go shoot and edit after this. Instagram I use, everything's at Paul Revelia. Pretty straightforward. And then my company name is prophysique.com. So that's where we have some free training programs on there. We've actually put out some stuff for at-home training. So we're putting out a lot of information on prophysique.com, videos, content, as well as information about our coaching. There.
Sorry, we had to lag out for a second.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, though. Thanks for sharing that, though. I caught most of it. If anyone, needs to listen to or couldn't hear the audio, I'll have it linked in the description below on YouTube, and you can follow us on Stitcher, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts as well. Paul, again, thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate it, guys. Have a good day.
Thank you so much, Paul.
See you guys.
Take care, everyone.